I believe it was Samuel Clemens who is purported to have said, I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so instead I wrote you a long letter. The last time I did this, I think all the other times I've done this, it's been a 10-week course. This is the first time I've tried to do this in 5 weeks. So of necessity, what we're going to have is you may want to fasten your seatbelts. We're going to be going through 2,000 years of church history in 5 weeks. So here's the basic outline. On the first page, you have kind of the outline of what we're doing. That's what we're going to be doing today. The subsequent pages are the notes. I've taken the liberty of taking notes for you. That's important to me right now because nowadays with cell phones and iPads, if I see you all there with your iPhones and your cell phone, I can't tell if you're bored or if you're just taking notes. So I figured I'd just save you the trouble. There's lots of space on the paper. You can take more notes if you want to. You'll see what we're doing. Then at the end of this session, we're going to have a devotion. Actually, it's in the form of the ancient order of Matins, and I'll tell you why I chose that as we get along with this study. This particular day is probably going to be the most difficult for you from the point of view of keeping your interest because it's the most far removed. We're beginning with the Jewish roots of Christianity. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was born into a Jewish household. The way that Jesus himself worshipped would have been in a Jewish manner. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. Next week we'll be talking about the early church. That would be the church for the first, early and not so early, the first 1,000 years or so. I'm going to hit 1,000 years of history next week. Okay? The following week we'll be going on to the Great Schism, the split between the Eastern and Western churches. Then the week after that we'll be talking about the Reformation era and what came just after that. And then finally, our last session on the 5th week will be about contemporary worship issues, the state of American Protestantism, and what might be next on the American church state. So that's where we're going. So just to begin, you can go ahead and look at these sheets. Jesus, as I mentioned, is a Jew. You'll notice, please, I didn't say Jesus was a Jew. Jesus is a Jew. And that's important because we as Christian people believe that God used the Jewish nation, the Jewish race, if you will, to bring about what I've called the solution to all of the world's problems. By the way, just a little bit of advisement here. I really love history. I particularly love ecclesiastical history. I love music and the mechanics of worship and liturgy, but my deepest passion in life is the gospel. My deepest passion in life is to be able to convey the gospel. I probably wouldn't do this at all if there weren't some way of wheedling in gospel truths in a new way in the process. So, if it sounds a little preachy, it means I'm doing my job. So God uses the Jewish people, specifically the Jewish people, to bring about what I call the answer to all of the world's problems. And the answer to the world's problems, what are the world's problems? It's just one word. Sin. Thank you. The world's problems are sin. The world's problems are the fact that we turned away from God. And God uses the Jewish nation to bring about the one who is the answer, the one we call the Messiah, or Moshiach, in the Hebrew and in the Aramaic, by the way, or in Greek, the Christ, the anointed one, the chosen one. So, in order to have any idea at all about the way in which the church began to worship, those who followed in the footsteps of Jesus, those who became the disciples of his disciples, to understand how they began to worship, we need to look back to the way that the Jews worshipped. So when you think about Jewish worship, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in New York, and in New York, at least where I lived, either you were Catholic or you were Jewish. And I was probably embarrassingly far along in my grade school career before I realized that the definition of Lutheran was not actually not Catholic. It was about the same time I also realized that, if Jews had a religious star, that six-pointed Star of David, that beautiful symbol, well, why couldn't we Christians have a star too? I mean, we got a cross. It's an instrument of execution. We make it pretty, but why can't we? Anyway, I spent a lot of time in synagogues as a young person because, I went to a lot of bar mitzvahs. A lot of my friends were Jewish, and you got to just take one look at me to see that I really began to enjoy that good Jewish food too. But when you think about Jewish worship, what comes to mind? Synagogue, okay. Separation of men and women. Okay, what else?
Rabbi.
It's similar to ours. Yes, actually, we're going to be talking about how it's similar a little bit. What else?
Rabbi.
The rabbi. Okay, what's a rabbi, Pastor?
You're a teacher.
Thank you. Yeah, rabbi literally means my teacher, by the way. This is a personal expression. My teacher.
They don't have any music.
Were you ever a
They sing,
cantor?
but they do not.
Was I ever a cantor? The quickest way to empty a room is to get me to sing. I have been described as a frog with perfect pitch. You might not think that Bob Dylan could have had a musical career until you hear recordings of me singing Lutheran liturgy. And then, okay. What I want to suggest to you is that when we think of Jewish worship, especially Jewish worship from this particular period, which, by the way, we're still going to refer to as Temple Judaism. The period that Jesus is living, his earthly life, is Temple Judaism. And that's the most important thing, by the way. The quintessential element of Judaism and of their worship is the temple. Now, I heard a gentleman say synagogue. What's the difference between synagogue and temple?
There was one temple, right?
There's one temple. Well, when I was growing up in New York, we had a lot of places with names like Temple Beth Shalom. It went on. And some of the Jewish kids, my compatriots, said, "Oh man, it's Friday, I've got to go to temple." But that is a decidedly modern nomenclature. In Jesus' day, there was extant only one temple. There were any number of synagogues already by Jesus' day. There were any number of synagogues, but there was one temple. And I want you to take a look at your sheet, and you'll see right there the first topic. It says Temple Basics. And if you would turn to page 2. The pages aren't mercifully numbered. I know we're used to doing things with overhead projections and all that, but since it's a history class, I decided to go Gutenberg on you and waste some copyright, and maybe next week I'll do PowerPoint, I don't know. But for now, throwback Wednesday. Is that temple? Here's just some basic temple facts that I wanted to point out. I'm not going to read all of this. I just want to go through some of the highlights. We can find a description. There's a scriptural description of the temple. Actually, there are a couple of them, but most specifically, we can read about this in 1 Kings 6, 7, and 8. Who built the temple? Solomon built the temple. Now, it's kind of an interesting story. There's just a little anecdote, and here's, I guess, one of the places where I'll get preaching just for about a minute or so. Solomon built the temple, but it was Solomon's father, who was David, who wanted to build the temple. Now, David wanted to build the temple, but he couldn't. The Midrash, the Jewish commentary, the Midrash, at least one, suggests that David didn't get to build the temple because of this whole ugly incident with Uriah and Bathsheba. And it's just kind of an interesting thing that we think about that Uriah and Bathsheba thing as an adultery story as opposed to a murder story. And it shows where our minds are. the reason given. But the scriptures might indicate something else about that. You see, if we were to read along this history, we would discover that, and this is a lesson to all of us, that David gets it in his mind. Maybe a little bit of guilt. David says some words to the effect of, here I am in this beautiful palace. I got a soft bed. I got fine linens. I got all kinds of fancy gold stuff. I got way too many wives. Let's have after one more now. But the presence of the Lord, the Shekinah of the Lord, is in a tent. That isn't right. I want to build God a house. Now here's the story becomes very interesting. At least it's interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to you as well. David speaks to someone who knows better than him. He calls his buddy Nate. That's the prophet Nathan to you and me. And he says to the prophet Nathan, I have in mind to build God a house. What does Nathan say? Not quite. Nathan says, great idea, man. Nathan says, yes, you have in mind the things of God. Now, this is a prophet, mind you. It's a guy who talks to God. At least God talks to him. God has to come to Nathan in a dream. Read the story sometime. God comes to Nathan and says, no, Nate, that's not the way it's going to be. I don't want David to build me a house. And by the way, while we're on this topic, am I a man? Do I even need a house? The earth is my footstool. Heaven itself is my throne. But since you people seem to be so hung up on this idea, David's son, Solomon, can build me the house. But tell David I have bigger plans. For I don't need David to build me a house. I'm going to build a house out of him. What's the lesson? A lot of them, I suppose. But at least one of them is we can get into our minds things that we think are God's will. We think God needs this. How many colleagues have I heard say, I'm about the business of doing God's will. God needs me to do his will. I'm sorry, brothers and sisters, but I don't think God needs anyone to do his will. I think God is just fine on his own. God gives us the privilege of doing his will. But even the prophet Nathan gets caught up in this building plan. Even the prophet Nathan winds up with a bad case of brick and mortar lust. That's never happened to me here, has it? No, of course not. Never happens to church people. Never happens to Lutherans. We don't care about our buildings, do we? No. Well, this is all important for us because for the Jewish people, this concept of the presence of God was hugely important. Presence of God, the Shekinah, the visible presence of the invisible God. Back in Moses' days, running across the wilderness, there was the pillar of fire by, and a pillar of cloud by. Well, something like that. You have to see the clouds in the day and a fire at night, okay? It's kind of logical, right? Okay, so, and the presence of God dwelt where? In the Ark of the... Well, that's another example of theophany, by the way. But by the time we get to wandering around in the wilderness, a little after that whole burning bush incident, the presence of God is believed to be in this Ark of the Covenant. And then the presence of God is believed to be in the temple, within the Holy of Holies, by the way, where they stored the Ark of the Covenant. At least until the end of the first temple. Back to page 2 for just a moment. Okay? So you can see just a little bit of this. He's going to read some of this to you. The first temple. If we look at the scriptural dates, we come up with something like, I should have put Kirka, a little C period. I should have put Kirka, 957. But there's some debate on that. And by the way, ancient rabbinical sources forward date that about 165 years, give or take. We go back to the 2nd century, the most authoritative rabbinical sources, and they will tell us that the archaeological and even scholarly discussions of this are wrong by 165 years. It's not scripture, so I'm going to go with the archaeologists. 957, roughly, temple construction begins. Okay? Remember, these are BC years, so they go the wrong way, right? Okay? First temple completely destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. I did a number on the rest of Jerusalem as well, by the way. And by the way, that's also the last we hear of the Ark of the Covenant. We don't know what happened to it. Jewish scholars, rabbinical sources, will say one of two possibilities. One, it was stolen and carried off into Babylonian lands. Two, it was buried in the ground. It was buried in the ground so that nobody could get at it, so it wouldn't be stolen. Later on, somebody would make a movie with Harrison Ford and all that. The aftermath of it. Really good, I go over the organ now and play that Indiana Jones theme, but I repented of such parlor tricks. So the first temple is destroyed. And that's a huge problem. I'll talk about why in a moment, because I just want to get through this little historical piece here. We get to the Second Temple. You can read about this in the book of Ezra if you choose to. Again, from a scholarly perspective, from an archaeological perspective, this happened under the reign of Cyrus the Great. Persian king, by the way. Cyrus the Great. 538 BCE. Temple was completed by his successor, Darius the Great. Read about that in Ezra 5. In the 6th year of his reign, 516 BCE. Temple dedication taking place the following year. While we're on the topic of the temple, because it is crucial to our understanding of Jesus, the Jews commonly talk about the first temple and the second temple. And at least Jews who are of decidedly conservative Orthodox bent are waiting for the building of the third temple. Many conservative Christians are also waiting for the building of the third temple. Because there's a common belief that from Jerusalem will come the Messiah and this will usher in the new age. But here's something very interesting. Herod the Great. Herod the Great who decides, King Herod trembled for his throne and all that stuff. The guy who decides he needs to kill all the kids because he's afraid a new king is born. The wise guys come and visit him. You know the story. Herod the Great was a builder. Or at least he admired builders. Herod the Great liked to start building projects. I guess that's because that's how you made a name for yourself. So Herod the Great, somewhere around 20 BCE, decides, I want to rebuild this temple. Herod's ostensibly Jewish. He's a highly Hellenized Jew, but he's ostensibly Jewish. So as a show of piety, but most also as a show of his own power and authority, Herod decides to rebuild this temple. Now, if you talk about it to an Orthodox Jew, he's going to say, well, he renovated it. He enlarged it. The reality is that Herod's temple has the same dimensions as the previous temple. He just built a courtyard that was about the size of 10 football fields around it. But the other thing that he did, and here's why I bring it up, is he completely razed the temple that was built, which is discussed in Ezra. He took it right down to the foundation stones. There are some stories that he even leveled out the Temple Mount so that he could build a bigger courtyard around it. Kind of like we do today. We take whole forests and we level them out. Mountains in the way, dynamite and bulldozers, and now we've got a field. Apparently, that's what Herod did. So, at the risk of being iconoclastic and discover very quickly that I can be that a lot of times, I question the logic of calling Herod's temple the second temple, because it was effectively completely rebuilt. A new structure. It's kind of like if you lived in a house. If you lived in a house and you decided you wanted to renovate, but you sit down and you start crunching your numbers, and you realize, well, the kind of renovation I want is I just want to take it down to the foundation. And then you look at the foundation and say, well, actually the foundation's not looking too good. It's just a bunch of sleepers. I think I want to go concrete now. Do you call that the same house just because it's got the same address? Just something for you to think about. What follows on page 2 is a description. I'm not going to go through all this. We're going to run out of time. I'm not going to go through this, but there were 13 gates in the temple. They all had names. They all had purposes. Most of them are pretty obvious, like the upper gate. Well, that's kind of the highest point. The kindling gate. That's where they brought the wood in for the fires. The gate of the firstborns. You understand how this, you've heard enough of this, right? Sacrifice had to be made, a pure and unblemished firstborn animal. That's where they brought them. Everything seemed to have its own gate. If you turn to the second page, you'll discover, sorry ladies, there was even a women's gate. Somebody mentioned the men and the women set. In Orthodox synagogues to this day, men and women sit apart. And it isn't, it's not really a sexual thing. Can you say sexual in church? I guess I just did. Okay, it's not really a sexual thing. It has more actually to do with the fact that men and women have separate roles that are not to be confused. There were also issues of ritual purity and so forth. That's really getting complex, but in Orthodox synagogues you'll still see that. In most conservative, and certainly in most Reformed synagogues, you'll see it's kind of like going to a Lutheran church. Everybody files in the back pews first, and families sit together. And if it's a Reformed synagogue, they talk a lot before church too. I just figured I'd get that in there too. Okay, page 3. Page 3 is a diagram, a decidedly simplified diagram of what the temple looked like. Okay, I found some really, really complicated diagrams that would take hours to just explain what they meant. This one seems pretty simple. Okay, oversimplification. That's a disclaimer. It's an oversimplification. On the outside is the court of the Gentiles. Okay? To the south of that is Solomon's portico. That may have been one of the places where Jesus taught, by the way. The other place where Jesus taught apparently was in the temple treasury, but by the way, the temple treasury is known as the court of the women. I'm just waiting for that to sink in now, okay? And this is Rome, has already said Lutherans here, I guess. Jesus taught in the court of the women. Whatever you do with that. On the outside, the court of the Gentiles, if you were not a Jew, that's as far as you got. Herod's temple is one of the great wonders of the world. It was probably the most incredible thing anyone had ever seen. The most massive, the most beautiful structures. Pilgrims came from all over the place. Did you ever do that? Did you ever see a building? Or maybe not even a building, it's a natural wonder. And it's just so beautiful. It makes you want to worship. Even if that's not the purpose of it. I remember the first time I saw our nation's capital. And don't get me started with politics. Donkeys, elephants, donkeys, it drives me nuts. But first time I saw our nation's capital, I wanted to genuflect and cross myself. Not because I'm a constitutionalist or a Tea Party or a commie or anything in between. I'll keep you guessing. It's just, I'm an artist and I appreciate beauty, and it was just so darn beautiful. And I said, wow, what a wonderful creator that gives human beings such skill. Sometimes I hear pieces of music by people that I know were atheists. And it makes me want to worship. Because in spite of themselves, like the mute stars in the heaven, they declare the glory of God. So people came from all over the place. Gentiles came to worship, sometimes to worship their own gods, occasionally to find out what this God of Israel is all about, but they could only get as far as the court of the Gentiles. Now you get to the court of Israel. The court of Israel, by the way, that's if you were a woman, that's as far as you got. It's kind of like being in the Missouri Synod. You know, you can get as far as being a deaconess, whatever that is. You want to be a pastor? Ain't going to happen. Go on up over to Advent or something. I just want to make sure you're awake, that's all. You know, there's no better way to keep people awake than just to throw in a couple of things, a few outrageous things, just to see if you're listening. All right, we get to the court of the men, that's obvious. That's as far as the lay people got. That's it. Court of the priests. Court of the priests. How do you get to be a priest? Thank you. Oh, you mean, I can sit there, you folks can teach this course. If I see you all nodding off to sleep, it's not because I'm not loud enough, it's because I'm just telling you stuff you already know. That's cool. Sooner or later, I'll stumble upon something you don't know. So, yeah, you didn't go to seminary and get ordained. You didn't go to college and study really hard, learn a bunch of ancient languages, and take, all these kind of crazy courses that you gotta take. And Pastor Al's nodding, bringing back memories.
You were born into it.
You were born into it. Now, some Lutheran pastors think they were born into it too.
Well, I was.
Yeah, I know your story. That's why I said that. Yeah, very frequently. Like my confirmation pastor and one of my earliest mentors, as I got older, he was the guy who convinced me that if I really wanted to be able to teach Bible, I had to learn Greek. So I did. Well, his father was a pastor, and his father was before him. By the way, my confirmation pastor was Joel Janzow, and his father was F. Samuel Janzow. Now, if you're an old-timey Lutheran, and if you're into hymnals and stuff, you know who F. Samuel Janzow is. He's one of Missouri Synod's greatest translators. The greatest translator. He happened to be a poet. Happened to be a poet as well. There are a few hymns that he wrote that found their way to this. I don't think there are any in our current hymnal because he was pretty abstract in his poetry. He was great buddies with Carl Schulk, if you know who that is. And anyway, you were born into being. I can digress, obviously. You were born into the priesthood. Let me get back to my outline here. Just a couple of things. Temple. It's important. It's really important, and it's important for two primary reasons. The first reason we've already discussed. It's the presence of God if you're a Jew. The closest thing we have in Christendom, if you are Roman Catholic, or if you are Anglo-Catholic, that's High Church Episcopalian, or if you're certain types of Orthodox, you have a sense that once the priest consecrates the elements, they really are the body and blood of Christ. And that's Jesus' presence. By the way, just so you know, we LCMS people, technically we believe that too. That's the real presence. We just don't act sometimes. But for those folks, they will take whatever is left over and they will put it into the thing that, by the way, it's called a tabernacle. You might have one. Go ahead. They put it into a tabernacle, and you treat that thing basically like it's Jesus. In the Roman Catholic Church, there are whole services where you do nothing but look at a wafer. Host. Ostia. You look at a wafer, it's in this great big giant beautiful $10,000 frame called a monstrance. And you adore the Blessed Sacrament. You take it seriously. Well, that's kind of the level of devotion the Jews had for the presence of God in the temple. And that made Jerusalem the religious epicenter. The other reason the temple was important becomes disproportionately important right about the time of the Babylonian captivity. What did you do in the temple? What do you actually do in the temple? Not you personally, but what was done there? Thank you. That's basically what happened. That was the primary activity in the temple. Now there were services there, typically 3 times a day, everything. There were a lot of activities. They were all focused on sacrifice for the purpose of atonement. What's atonement?
Making that one.
Yeah, that's such a Protestant definition. It's such a Protestant definition, and I like it. And with another group I'm working with, I'm doing a whole Lenten series on atonement, and that's one of the terms we use. But atonement, from the Jewish perspective, is undoing the problem. That's atonement. Say, for example, I went over to Lovey, and I just decided for no particular reason, I take his glasses off first. And once I took his glasses off, I just belted him.
That's undoing the problem.
There's one in every crowd. Okay, one of the rules, I'm the comedian, you all be the straight man, okay? That's where I get the big bucks. Now, that would be a nasty thing to do to Lovey. In fact, even just using him as a sermon object lesson is a nasty thing to do to him. And you'd all probably agree. And I would have to work very hard to get back in all of your good graces, assuming I'm in your good graces now. I would have to work very hard. I would have to do something to atone for that. Probably in front of all of you, and for Lovey, and probably for my employers here at this church. Because we can't really have somebody who goes around randomly hitting people in the middle of a Bible study. So how would I atone for that? Well, I'd probably have to go to anger management, sensitivity trainings. If Lovey decided to press charges, I'd probably have to do 50 hours of community service and pay him for his broken nose. Because I hit hard, let me tell you. And in some fashion, I might be able to make atonement. Resolving the problem. You see, Jews were profoundly aware that they were sinful. This is not a John the Baptist idea. It's certainly not a Jesus idea. It's certainly not a St. Paul idea. Well, it's their idea, but it's not uniquely their idea. Jews were very, very aware of their sinfulness. The reason I say this atonement part became so important after the Babylonian captivity is because the Midrash tells us that they believe that the destruction of the first temple was God's punishment for their sinfulness. There are some theological reasons not to believe that. But then again, I suppose from their perspective, there are many theological reasons to believe it.
So what's the difference between atonement and pacification, purification?
Well, you see, purification is... let me put it into a Christian context. If I just hit Lovey, and then, I don't know, maybe Phyllis said, I know Lovey can be tough sometimes, but you didn't have to go hit him. That's a little over the top. You really should apologize. In fact, you really ought to offer to pay for his medical bills. And I said, no. He deserved it. I don't forgive him, and I don't care if he forgives me. And then I go over to Mr. Phyllis. I go over to Pastor Al. And I say, Pastor Al, do me a favor. I really want to take communion. There is only one appropriate response to that.
You better solve that problem.
Thank you. Why? Now this is not the theological term we use in the Lutheran Church. It absolutely is not. But psychologically and in praxis, the actual practice. It's the same kind of thing. I'm not prepared to go before God's altar and partake of the body and blood of our Savior until I solve the problem with my brother.
So is that confession?
Purification is what the Jews did before they could even get close to the temple. When, I don't know why, Mrs. Organist can tell you, I've been picking on women all day today. I did the other Bible study I just read over online. Women, sorry ladies, I didn't make this stuff up. I'm not even sure it's a particularly good idea. When Jesus was born, he was conceived in an extraordinary way, but he was born in an ordinary way. And those of you who are moms, at least some of you who are dads, that includes me, know that birth is not a nice, neat, sanitized process, is it? From the Jewish perspective, the woman who just gave birth was unclean. Had to do with a whole lot of things. Before Mary could even get anywhere near the temple, in fact, really before she could even get anywhere near her husband, she had to be purified. In the Roman Catholic Church, that's a festival, a purification of Mary. We kind of acknowledge it somewhere in tiny, tiny print in the Lutheran calendar too. The purification of Mary. There were a lot of things you had to do, a lot of things you could do in your daily life. Like walking in the dirt, or petting a dog, or shaking hands with somebody you didn't know as a Jew or a Gentile, that rendered you ceremonially unclean. And then there were things that you did in yourself, or things that you thought. Like, again, we'll be chauvinistic here. You're walking down the street, and it's summertime, and there's a girl of summer wearing whatever, and you go, "Ooh, that girl looks nice." I think we call that lust. And that makes you spiritually unclean. Jews knew that, by the way, before Jesus said so. Really, they did. So you have to be purified before you can come into the presence. That's what it's about, lovey. You have to be purified before you can even do these things. By the way, that's a point about atonement that I'll just make here. From the Jewish perspective, the animal sacrifice, people will sometimes say, "Yeah, I sinned." If we sin, and before Jesus, we used to have to go and kill some poor hapless heifer and spread its blood on the altar, and that would appease God. No. A close reading of the Levirate law will tell you, no. The only way that might work is if it's something unintentional. Again, I shook hands with somebody and they're not really a Jew, therefore I'm unclean now, but I didn't know. Or I was just trying to be gracious. That's an unintentional sin. Or at least so the Midrash says. But if I sin intentionally, you could kill anything. You could kill a dozen sheep, 10 bulls. It's not going to atone for that. This, by the way, is why in Psalm 51, which we'll read a little later, says, God doesn't want your sacrifice. Contradiction in Scripture? No, not at all. God doesn't want your animal sacrifice, because that's not going to make up for the condition of your heart. The only way you can atone for an intentional sin from a Jewish perspective, stop doing the sin, repent, literally turn around, do something else for a long enough period of time that the society recognizes you're different, then you'll make your sacrifice. Purification. Jerusalem as religious epicenter, Jerusalem as financial epicenter. How many people does it take to run a church? How many people? Two. Two? What two?
Me and you.
I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I mean, I'm hoping there's some deep theological meaning to that, but I'll figure it out later. It'll probably hit me at 3 o'clock in the morning, and if it does, trust me, I'm giving you a call. That's 1 hour before I get up, by the way. See the bags under my eyes? This is a middle afternoon for me, by the way. Yeah. Somewhere between 18 and 20,000 priests served in the temple every year. Now, they weren't all there at once. The way this worked, by the way, is that typically speaking, only a certain number of people were full-time, we'd say clergy. If your last name were Levi, as in you were part of the tribe of Levi, or if it were Cohen, or some variation thereof, you're a priest. That's it, it's your birthright. It's also your obligation. But we're not going to pay all you people. We're going to have you serve, kind of like on a rotation, kind of like the altar guild. You know, if you made your altar guild ladies do it every single week, the same people, pretty soon they'd be wanting a salary. Put them on rotation, they might forget about the hard work by the time it comes their turn again. That's how it worked with those Levites. That's how it worked with those priests. They had a rotation. However, at any given time, there were probably about 700 priests and Levites running around the temple. And they did some things we don't associate with priests. Again, let me direct your attention here. Let's see. Page 6. Page 6. Stuff that happened in the temple. Stuff that happened in the temple. You know, what I really wanted to do was to kind of act out a service in the temple. But I can't, because there wasn't just one. You start off somewhere in the middle of Exodus, you go all the way through the book of Deuteronomy, and all that literature are specific descriptions for the way in which you do stuff in the temple. That's why I always tell people, if you've never read the Bible before, please don't start at the beginning and work your way through. Yeah, those Genesis kind of Sunday school stories, they're kind of interesting. But by the time you get to the middle of Exodus, all of a sudden you just have a bunch of, it's about like reading constitutional law. I mean, it just isn't very interesting. It really had to be called that to be interesting. But in a nutshell, this is the kind of stuff that happened in the temple. Bottom of the page, the bullet points. The slaughtering of animals. The temple, wonder of the world, beautiful place. Have you ever been to a slaughterhouse?
Yes.
You have? Okay. You know, I lived in the Midwest for a while. I served the church. It was kind of interesting. I served the church in Illinois, which is over the river from Iowa. I lived in Davenport, Iowa. I was going to school at the time at the University of Iowa. It was 60 miles away from Davenport on a straight line along I-80 in Iowa City. Somewhere between Davenport and Iowa City is a meat rendering plant for hogs, mostly. I believe it was owned by Oscar. Assuming it's still there. Slaughterhouse. Little known fact, I was also a long-haul truck driver for a little while. Cattle bar. Imagine that smell. Imagine the shrieking of the animals. Been inside a slaughterhouse? Seen a place called the killing floor? It's sanitized now. It's all stainless steel and automatic washing and all this kind of stuff, supposedly done humanely. Not so then. Stone floor, animals held suspended in such a way, again oversimplification, cut the jugular, let them bleed out. Blood everywhere. Shrieks of animals everywhere. That's the temple. Hundreds upon hundreds of pilgrims every day making sacrifice. When we got to the holy days, particularly Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, thank you, yes. Thousands of animals.
What did they do with the carcasses?
They burned them. That was a sacrifice. You see, that was the idea. That's the sacrifice. That goes back, by the way, to somewhere in your notes it says that prior to the temple, prior to the first temple, people built altars where they felt they should. What's an altar? Theologians argue, is that thing an altar? Is that an altar?
No.
What is it? That's the Lord's table. Now, the altar is a place now, Roman Catholic Church, where the theology is such that we continually sacrifice Christ, at least old traditional Catholic, that's an altar. Altar, place of sacrifice. You build them anywhere before the temple. You wanted to give thanks? Take, for example, Cain, Abel. They had no temple. Something compelled them. It was time to give thanks to God. Cain takes his offerings of what? What did Cain have? Grain, crop, stuff like that. Abel had what? Yeah. I guess God's not a vegetarian. Cain's offering didn't work out so well for him. Apparently the sweet, savory smell of that meat worked really well. I don't know why. I got theories on it. A lot of theories. So that's what you did. Now, in some cases when there was a surplus, these people were practical. We got 18,000 priests and Levites we had to feed. We also have some poor people. Some of that food, especially the non-perishables, the grains and so forth, were put into a storehouse. But most of the meat was just sent up in smoke. So here's what you got. You got blood, you got charred animal bones, you got guys' investments splattered with blood. That's what's going on in the temple. Dedications took place in the temple. Dedications. For example, Jesus is 8 days old. He's brought to the temple. Okay? Back in the old day, we called this thing the Feast of the Circumcision. The pastor I used to work with got a real kick out of, those old boards used to have? They would be about right about here. They have like the hymn numbers on them. And it would usually say something like, Quasimodo Geniti Sunday or something like that, I bet you had thought about that for a while. Only the real Lutherans are laughing at that, okay? Well, the pastor used to get a real kick out of, climbing up there before church and changing what the old guild had and put Circumcision Day. Well, that's a festival, circumcision of our Lord, because that's the Abrahamic promise. God makes his presence in our lives known. God makes the covenant known in the most intimate of ways possible. That's what every Jewish male was expected to do. Mercifully, it was typically done when they were only 8 days old. I have no idea if it doesn't hurt them, but at least you don't remember by the time you can talk. So that was the other thing that was done there. When you came of age, when you became a man in the faith, well, that's not entirely true. You weren't quite a man, but you were on your way. You became a bar mitzvah. That was also done there in the temple. All of these things were taking place in the temple. There were ritual prayers, daily prayers, again, typically 3 times a day. And that brings us to Jerusalem as economic center. The temple was also a bank. It did all the things a bank did. What does a bank do?
Take your money.
Yeah, that's about right, yeah. Okay, so banks are repositories for money. And in the old days, you used to put your money in, you used to get interest. You still do now, but I didn't get far enough in math to figure the numbers out that are so small. You put your money there, and it's supposedly safe. Insured by the FDIC, right? Okay, at least up to $100,000. Well, that's more than I have to worry about, so I'm okay. You could keep your money in the temple treasury. And by the way, that's exactly what devout Jews did. They kept their money in the treasury. But the other thing that banks do is they exchange money. Do they not?
Yeah.
I've traveled overseas, and when I travel over to Germany, now maybe there's some mom and pop shops that'll do it for you, but for the most part, my American greenbacks, backed by the full faith and credit of the American government, are uninteresting to a German shopkeeper. I have to change that into Deutschland marks, right? Because they won't take it.
Euro.
I have to change it. And by the way, now it's euros, yeah. I have to change that into, thank you, yeah. I'm old-fashioned, that's throwback,
Euro, schmoro.
Another bright idea we've had. Let's change that. Why? What happens when you change it? Do they just give you an even rate, 1 for 1? They take a cut. Very good, thank you. So, if you were coming to, you were one of these pilgrims, and you know what you're going to do in the temple, you're going to make a sacrifice, you're going to give some gifts, you're going to give gifts, right? Tithing. It's interesting, by the way, the tithe is an Anglicanization of that. Tithe really means 10%. If you add up what was expected of you, it actually comes to around 17%. I don't know, just an interesting fact. The biblical tithe is probably around 17%. That number should sound familiar to some of you. So, you're a pilgrim. You're a pilgrim. You're going to bring your tithe, you're going to bring your gift. You're coming from someplace far away. In those days, 10, 20 miles away perhaps. Long journey. Do you just take one of your own sheep and the money? Why not? Why ever not? Yeah. It's probably not pure. Chances are your animal will not meet standards. And it has to be pure. No blemishes. It has to be a firstborn. And by the way, the temple's not taking your word for another bank-like thing. Hey, I need a loan. Well, how much money do you have? Oh, I got a lot of money. Prove it. If I could prove it, I wouldn't need the loan. You make sure your credit is good. I don't take your word for it. All kinds of electronic things first. The temple did not take your word for it that your animal was good enough. Buy one from us. They're certified. Money, Jewish money, was not Jewish money. Rome did not give Jews the authority to coin their own money. They used, whose picture's on the coin, asks Jesus. Yeah. That money's unclean. Can't put that in the temple treasury. What do? You exchange it. At an exchange rate. You buy the animals. Okay, I don't want to get into this politically, but I want to make a suggestion here. The same family, by the way, they were Sadducees, religiously and politically, the famous family from whence the high priests derived, also owned the majority share in the bank, temple bank, and the meat markets. Can you play Monopoly with me? Okay, so that's what's going on. So now, all of this stuff is to give you an idea, just a little bit of a flavor, and again, it's an oversimplification on many levels, to give you an idea of the world into which Jesus enters. This is the world into which the Lord of life comes. This is the religious landscape, if you will. What I'm doing now is taking out my postmodern pocket watch to see how I'm doing for time. And I see that I have roughly 15 minutes to get to the next 75 years. So, yeah. And that's because I talk too much. Let's talk about the synagogue for a moment. Somebody mentioned synagogue. When I grew up, temple, synagogue, kind of interchangeable terms. They shouldn't be. Even for the Jews, they should not be. Because Orthodox Jews are still looking, as I mentioned before, for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Maybe you've known Jewish folks who make a pilgrimage. Deuteronomy 16:16 says that every Jewish male must present himself before the presence of the Lord 3 times a year. By the time we get to Jesus' day, that meant everybody had to come to the temple 3 times a year. But they couldn't. They just couldn't. By the time we get to Jesus' day, we were already technically into diaspora Judaism. There were Jews everywhere, at least everywhere in the known world. And some of them are simply too far away to get to the temple, pragmatically speaking. In fact, if you're on the other side of Judea, you might not be able to make it 3 times a year. Same reason as, I'd like to be able to go to, I'd like to be able to go to Europe 3 times a year, and see all of my personal temples, the birthplace of Bach and the organ where Buxtehude played. And, but I can't do it because I have neither the time nor the money to do that. So it was in Jesus' day as well. Love to, can't. It's one of the reasons why synagogues came to be. But I believe the majority reason, the major reason why synagogues came to be actually goes back to the 7th chapter of, the 8th chapter of Nehemiah, 8th chapter of Nehemiah, where the prophet Ezra does what? He does something weird for his day. He reads the law out loud to the entire assembly. He institutes the public reading of the law. To this day, the primary activity in a synagogue, at least conservative synagogues, is the reading of the law. There are lots of prayers. If you look on page 8, you'll see an example of what's done in a synagogue. Lots of prayers. But the most important part is right there. Takes place typically and historically on Mondays, Thursdays, the Sabbath, and on religious holidays, is the reading of the Torah, the reading of the law. That's the central focus. By the time we get to Jesus' day, there are synagogues all over the place. Jesus does first recorded preaching in a synagogue. Didn't go so well for him. Synagogue simply means place of assembly. We only have archaeological records of synagogues going back to the 1st century BC. Apparently there's nothing prior to that. Probably because prior to that, synagogues were mostly in people's homes. By the time we get to 1st century Judaism, they began to build permanent structures for synagogues. But this is what was done in the synagogues. Synagogues were the place of learning. Synagogues were the place where the local rabbi typically taught. There was some teaching that went on in the temple, but it was typically done volitionally. In other words, a rabbi would just set up camp in the colonnade, gather a bunch of people around. He'd sit down, everybody else would stand up. That's how they did it. Not like this. Something wrong with this. And start teaching. That's what Jesus does, by the way. That's how Jesus teaches. Jesus gathers people together. That wasn't so weird in those days. Everybody, well, at least if you were a rabbi. And rabbi simply means, as we talked about before, teacher. Synagogue was the place of the formal teaching. Okay, moving along as quickly as I can here. Worship in the home. When I was growing up, my mom told me there are 2 things you never talk about in public. You never talk about with anybody. You never talk about politics and religion. That commandment about honoring your father and your mother, I've tried. They'll even tell you I've tried. But mostly I've tried their patience. Because from the time I was old enough, I haven't stopped talking about politics and religion. And maybe I'm part Jew because that's what these folks talked about. You see, we tend, as American Christians, and maybe even more so, by the way, in Europe, we make real delineations between the secular life and the religious life. There are things we might wear out on the road, out on the streets. We'll go to a bar. Not that any of you go to bars, but I do. There are things we might do there, but not here. There's a way we might speak to our friends out there that we would modify when we come in here. There's music that we would listen to out there that we believe is inappropriate here. And on the list goes. Really not the case for the Jew. Sure, there were things that made them unclean where they had to be purified, but in general, despite the fact that they believed God's presence was in the temple, perhaps dualistically they also believed that God could see them everywhere. Not a bad thought to have, I suppose. So a good portion of worship took place in the home. For the observant Jew, every time the family gets together, it's a religious experience. I can make jokes about dysfunctional families and religious experience, but for the Jew, that's how it was. Every meal was an opportunity for prayer. Every meal was an opportunity to recount the stories of their forefathers. That's simply how it was. I remember years ago, I was working as a master technician at a piano store in Manhattan, and one of the dumbest ideas the guy who owned the place had was that I should be in sales. Perish the thought. And so I'm trying to sell pianos while I'm trying to fix pianos, and this guy comes in, and he's obviously an Orthodox Jew. And it's not the Sabbath or anything, it's the middle of the week, it's a Wednesday or something like that. And we're there, and it's a few minutes before lunchtime, and we're talking about this beautiful Steinway he wants to buy. And I'm already imagining his commission, mind you. And all of a sudden he asks me, what time is it? So I look at my watch, and I say, it's about a minute before. And he says, is there a quiet place I could go? Oh, it's kind of a wide open showroom. I mean, there's the men's room. I was like, it can't be that. Not pure. He says, okay, I'll just use this corner then. Won't take me but 5 minutes. Right there in the middle of Beethoven pianos on 58th Street in Manhattan, he starts praying. And not quietly. I'm going to tell you, I was convicted. Because I felt, wow, anybody who walks into the store cannot mistake this man's faith. Now, I know what Jesus said about don't be like the hypocrites playing in the marketplace and all that. I still thought there was something beautiful about it. Maybe because the guy was just so darn sincere about it. He didn't put me down because I wasn't one of him. He didn't make a big deal. It's just something I have to do. I wonder, what if we were like that? What if we said, yeah, I'm a Jesus person. Yeah, I'm a lot of other things. I'm a carpenter, bricklayer, school teacher, whatever. But first and foremost, I'm a Jesus person. What if we were like that?
It's like saying a prayer in a restaurant before a meal.
Yeah.
Hesitation of, well, should I do it?
Yeah, I do it all the time, actually. I do it all the time. And somebody's like, yeah, you would. I do it all the time. And it's kind of interesting because I've got all kinds of reactions from the waitstaff. As in, sir, you okay? Do you need an aspirin?
Yeah, but also...
Two people just outright interrupting. Excuse me, did you want fries with that?
The other reaction is they wait sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. Actually, probably more often than not, in all honesty. It's always the bad stuff we remember. But you're right, more often than not, actually do wait. Okay, we're kind of... Is everybody with me? Are there any other questions? I hope I'm not boring you to tears. I realize this particular segment is just kind of a long list of facts. Yes, sir, please.
You know about the economics of the Jews in those early days.
Yes, sir.
History tells us that the Jewish community or group to this very day, economically, is ahead of the power curve. It stays ahead of the power curve.
There probably are a lot of reasons.
Around the world.
There are a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons for that. The reasons that occur to me in my study of history actually come more out of the early medieval period than the period we're studying. There may be there's some strange paradoxes in that, having to do with usury. That's interest to you and me. Lots of interesting paradoxes to that exact fact. Well, we might get into that a little bit as we get later on, but yeah, it is a good point. Any other questions, comments, criticisms?
When did the custom of bat mitzvahs for girls come to be?
That's primarily a 20th century application. I could actually probably find a couple of late 19th century examples because there was a real liberal movement a real liberal, egalitarian movement, probably brought about by some of the same feelings that brought about, suffrage for women and things like that in kind of the big city synagogues. But for the most part, that's really a 20th century phenomenon. Yeah. Other questions?
Was there more to whole worship than just prayers and studies, Bible studies, stories passed down?
There were definitely stories that were passed down. If you happen to be lucky or unlucky enough to be in a family where dad was always dad, never mom, where dad was also a priest or part of that scribe, temple server, chances are there'd be lots of stories. Kind of like being a PK and having dad practice his sermons on it. There's a lot of that kind of thing about it. However, yes, the storytelling aspects was huge, still is. For example, I don't know if you've done like Christian seders or had Messianic Jews come here and enact seders for you. You even have Jews come and you've never been to a seder. But if you know something about that, then you know that entire thing is storytelling. That entire thing is a story, of the way in which God took his people out of bondage in Egypt and brought them through this journey, a journey by the way of purification and penitence, right? Wandering in the wilderness until they could find a national home. So yeah, lots of storytelling goes on at home, definitely. Probably not, again, unless dad's a priest, probably not Bible study in the way that we would think of. They weren't necessarily sitting there trying to exegete passages. And part of that is because they had a rich written, think of Judaism as an oral tradition, but by the time we get to Jesus' day, there's lots and lots of written stuff. Things called targums and kind of commentaries was sort of the standard way of interpreting scripture. Other questions?
I was interested in, you said Jesus taught the women. Do they also have their children?
Well, what I specifically said was that Jesus was teaching in the court of the women, but there are probably other people there too, like Gentile, not Gentile men, but other guys, young people. Chances are, yes, Jesus did teach children, and you all know this, right? Famous story. Beautiful story. So Jesus is teaching. I guess he's getting real heavy and serious and talking about all kinds of things, and there's some kids gathering around. Kids gathering around, right? And one of the disciples says, "Get these rugrats out of here." And Jesus says, it's one of those things, you'll hear me use this phrase a lot. I call this a Jesus dummy slap moment. You know what a dummy slap is? And I almost can imagine, here's the iconoclastic part, I can almost imagine Jesus going, "Oy myself." Because a Jew would say, "Oy vey." Yiddish, right? "Oh God." Well, Jesus would say, "Oy myself." And I can't believe you people are so stupid. Let the little children come to me. And we understand that unless we become as a little child, in innocence, in our trust, perhaps even in our acceptance of unbridled, unconditional love, we simply can't enter God's kingdom. Yeah. So the answer is yes. Other questions, thoughts? Okay, really quickly. Bottom of page 1, elements of Jewish worship that are concurrent with modern Christian worship. We have, for example, the public reading of the law. That was the purpose of the synagogues. Public reading of the law. Oh man, it's bad when your wife gets up and leaves. One too many woman jokes, I guess. Public reading of the law. Do we not have public reading of the law?
Old Testament?
The Old Testament. As a matter of fact, Pastor Al, you were probably taught like this. I know I was taught like this. How do you make a Lutheran sermon? Law, the gospel. In fact, there's a book that we all pretty much have to read. It is so exciting by a guy by the name of C.F.W. Walther. He's responsible for a lot. It's called Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel. Oh, it's a page turner. Good, you don't want to be sarcastic. No, it is actually a great religious tome, but I use the word tome advisedly. We're all taught. Knock them down with the law, build them back up with the gospel. Public reading of the law. The singing of the Psalms. Singing of the Psalms. By the way, if you'll learn this in a couple of weeks, if you're coming out of the Reformed branch, as in the Calvinist, the Zwinglian Calvinist branch of the Reformation churches, for the first century or more, that was the only music you could have. Psalms. No human poetry allowed. Psalms believed to be divinely inspired, that's okay. They changed after a while, but I'll talk about that later. Singing, we still have Psalms. Unfortunately, in my mind it's unfortunate, we mostly read them. They're much better when they're sung. The bringing of gifts. Bringing of gifts, we have bringing of gifts? Bringing of gifts. They did it for two reasons. I'm not going to say much about this, I'll just let it sit. They did it for two reasons. Partly to support the church. Hey, we got 18,000 priests we got to feed and clothe, but mostly out of recognition that there were those who did not have. Mitzvah of great importance for the Jewish people. Still is. Mitzvah, good deed. Part of the sacrifice that God truly desires. Giving to those who do not have. Republican, Democrat, fascist, commie, whatever. Giving to those who do not have. Major tenet of the Jewish faith. What about sacrifice? What is sacrifice? Sacrifice, huge aspect of Jewish worship. It's fallen out of practice now. And it's given Jews, well, there are some Jewish sects, rare, there are some that still do practice animal sacrifices. That's a rarity. For the most part, Jews, they're the ones, by the way, that come out of the Samaritan background. That's kind of a whole, that's a study in itself. But for the most part, Jews don't do, you don't go to the synagogue now and find his blood all over the floor because he just had to sacrifice a sheep. It's not done. They don't do it because there's no temple in which to have the sacrifice. But Orthodox Jews believe that will be reinstated. What about us? What's our sacrifice?
Yourselves.
Interesting. Ourselves? As in the sacrifices of God or a pure and contrite heart?
We sacrifice ourselves to the Lord in everything we do.
Interesting. Interesting. Any other thoughts? Sacrifice?
Oh, recognize God's sacrifice and
Yeah.
taking it where they want.
You see, this sacrifice of Jesus is a unique thing. Some might say it is the unique event of all time. God who has everything. The one who is present at the foundations of the universe. Not like a sheep who's either scared or doesn't know any better. Willingly goes to be sacrificed. I could call down 10,000 legions of angels if I wanted to. Instead, Christ chooses to make himself like a thief. Chooses to make himself like a criminal. Like the one crucified on his left side and on his right side. When we gather together, an idea, and we'll talk about Eucharistic theology in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk about the modern mess that is Eucharistic theology. I say modern mess because it's this understanding of the Eucharist that mostly is historically what sent Christianity spiraling in all kinds of different directions. Regardless of your perspective, real presence, transubstantiation, memorialism, all of these kinds of things, you'll learn all these words, I promise. When we gather together before the Lord's table to partake of his body and blood, it is of imperative importance that we remember that what we are doing is uniting ourselves with him. Now, for Lutherans, We believe that we are actually taking his body and blood into us. That it is the real presence of Christ, just like the real presence of God that dwells in the Ark of the Covenant. But for anybody approaching the Lord's table, we unite ourselves. We unite ourselves to Christ, desiring ultimately what? To be as he not was, but is. Jesus says to his disciples, I and the Father are one. Just as I am in him and he is in me, so you are in me as well. So yes, we do bring ourselves as a sacrifice. And we remember the sacrifice, the willing sacrifice of Christ on our behalf. I'll just teach you one Greek word here. I'm sure Pastor Al knows this one. The word is anamnesis. Anamnesis is a word that cannot be translated directly into English. Anamnesis translates roughly into objective recalling. The acting out of. When we come to the Lord's table, regardless of your theological perspective on this, what we are doing is we are acting out. We are acting out the miracle of time. We are acting out the thing that God did. The most glorious part of it, this is where I'll stop this particular segment, we'll go into our devotion. Going back to my hideous example of punching Lovey out, no matter what I did, it would never really be enough, would it? He'd probably never trust me again. He'd definitely never sit this far up front in the Bible study. He may not even now. And all the rest of you would be pretty wary of me too. You see, that kind of atonement is never complete. The atonement of Christ is totally complete. What Jesus did is, in Greek, teleios. Teleo. It is complete. Absolute. Complete in the sense of not unfinished. All other atonements were unfinished. As Paul wrote, the priest first has to make atonement for himself before he can even begin to make atonement for everyone else. In Christ we have a perfect high priest. A high priest forever. Okay, real quick, any questions? Questions?
We are sacrificed through Christ every day as we are changed and transformed to his likeness. Also, he says that we are to take up our cross and follow him. So those are all forms of sacrifices. As we are, in Galatians it says we are crucified with Christ. We die in our body, are decayed, but then when we die with him, we rise in glory.
Sure.
So we are sacrificed every day as we are.
Or similarly, as we hear in Romans, have we not been united with him in his death, buried with him, and shall what? Shall rise with him also. Or directly related to what you were saying, I would commend to you the 4th chapter of Ephesians. The 4th chapter of Ephesians, one of my favorite, by the way, which speaks to us directly of this process of being transformed into the likeness of Christ.